Welcome back for yet another true crime episode. I will cover two stories in this video. I hope you like it. But before we start, as always, please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. And also like the video, it helps very much. Thank you. Let's get to it. In the 1980s and early 90s, America learned to fear its own mail. What used to be routine, sorting, delivering, opening, suddenly felt like playing with fate. A padded envelope could explode in your hands. A package on your desk might be the last thing you ever touch. You heard right. Someone was sending letters around with bombs inside, with only one goal: to kill. Secretaries checked return addresses twice. Professors opened letters with gloves. Mailrooms installed mirrors, bomb shields, and new procedures. Even the hum of a sorting machine could make someone flinch. The attacks came without pattern. Universities 1 month, airlines the next. The devices were handmade, wooden, deceptively ordinary, and each was signed the same way. 2 letters, F, C. For nearly 2 decades, the figure behind those initials remained invisible, a ghost who struck from the wilderness, then disappeared back into it. But in 1996, the trail ended at a one-room cabin in Montana. Inside, tools, wiring, notebooks, and a manifesto that declared war on modern life itself. He wasn't just building bombs, he was building a philosophy of destruction, and in the end, it was language, not explosives, that gave him away. A dirt track, late winter, Lincoln, Montana. The cabin stood small, its dark boards weathered, a stovepipe leaning like a thin finger against the sky. Inside, agents would later say, the air held metal, oil, and paper. The raid team moved carefully, anticipating booby traps and hidden triggers. They had reason to be cautious. For nearly 2 decades, the devices signed FC had arrived without warning, traveling through mailrooms, desks, and college offices before detonating in spaces that should have been safe. By the early 1980s, a new kind of fear settled across the country. People looked twice at padded envelopes and cardboard boxes. Postal workers handled each delivery with a quiet tension. Professors, secretaries, airline staff, and graduate students all shared a small, unspoken ritual checking return addresses, watching for extra tape, listening for anything that rattled. The ordinary act of opening mail had become an act of trust. The FBI had spent years chasing a ghost. They built a task force, cycled through agents, and followed leads that collapsed one after another. Profilers argued over the offender's education, class, and motive, while the press weighed the danger of amplifying his message against the hope that publicity might stop him. Each quiet week felt like borrowed time. Each explosion erased that calm in an instant. What brought investigators to this door was language. Forensic linguists studied the manifesto and letters, mapping rhythms, phrasing, and the peculiar use of certain expressions, like, "you can't eat your cake and have it too." It was an odd reversal, one that caught a family's attention. David Kaczynski's wife noticed it first, then David himself, then an attorney. David gathered his brother's old writings and brought them to the FBI. He wasn't acting out of betrayal, but out of a desperate need to stop more deaths. He asked for discretion, for safety, and understood the cost of what he was doing. The Washington Post and the New York Times made a rare joint decision, publishing Industrial Society and its future at the FBI's request. The hope was simple, that someone, somewhere, would recognize the author's voice. When David did, the investigation shifted from theory to name, from name to location. The warrant took shape through words, typewritten quirks, themes from old essays, punctuation that acted like fingerprints. The door opened on a craftsman's bunker. A cot, a shelf of books on mathematics, primitive chemistry, anthropology, and survival. A manual typewriter. Boxes of nails, threaded rods, wires, batteries. On the workbench, tools for shaping wood to exact measurements, polished to disguise seams. Each homemade casing was carved to evade metal detectors. Every surface told the story of patience and precision. Agents found devices in various stages of creation. Early, crude switches had evolved into spring-loaded triggers and pressure plates designed for reliability. Chemical residues revealed experimentation, adjustments that reduced the chance of premature detonation. He had learned from every misfire, written those lessons in notebooks, and refined them, one device at a time. In a corner sat pages of his manifesto, annotated and retyped, marked with edits that read more like equations than arguments. The tone was controlled, deliberate. In his mind, He wasn't waging random violence. He believed he was fighting a defensive war against a system that stripped humanity from human life. Precision became his morality. For law enforcement, the cabin was both victory and burden. Inside were the fragments of past crimes and the blueprints for future ones. Investigators traced wood grain patterns, tool marks, and adhesive residues, connecting scenes across years and states. Even the typewriter impressions matched the letters sent to universities and newspapers. When agents pulled him from the cabin, he appeared gaunt, with a tangled beard and steady eyes. He immediately asked for legal representation, as if he had rehearsed this moment. Later, he would insist on defending himself, resisting any effort to frame his actions as madness. But on that cold day in Montana, the confrontation was physical and final, the end of one of the longest manhunts in American history. Looking back, that cabin was more than a hideout. It was a paradox, a place of solitude that produced violence, a retreat that reached into other people's lives without warning. To understand how such a space could exist, and why a mind so disciplined turned against the world, you have to go back to the boy who loved math. Chicago, post-war years, a modest home where discipline felt like structure and achievement was proof that the structure worked. He read early, solved problems quickly, and at school, teachers moved him ahead. Acceleration came as praise disguised as opportunity. It meant new classrooms, older faces, and a quiet message: you belong only if you are exceptional. The psychology of the moment is important because belonging narrowed while competence grew. He skipped a grade, then another. Children mark difference with precision. A boy 2 years younger, smaller, reserved, becomes an easy exclusion. Lunchtime talk drifts to sports, parties, minor rebellions. He answers with facts, equations, and silence. The gap widens. Adults admire the test scores. The child registers the cost. This is how isolation takes root, not as a single rejection, but as a daily pattern of being near people and never quite with them. At home, the family was stable, even loving, but firm. A supportive mother who tracked assignments and noticed moods. A strict father who prized work ethic and the clean logic of effort equals results. Rules were clear, talk was practical, emotions were acknowledged, but redirected back to outcomes. For many families, this becomes ballast. For a child who already confuses worth with performance, it can harden into a private contract. Be brilliant or disappear. He found sanctuary in mathematics. Numbers were neutral, demanding, consistent. In a world of cafeterias and hallways, there was a space where proof, guided behavior, and ambiguity did not hum in the background. He took comfort in the ritual of solving. Hours at a desk felt less like work and more like alignment with something orderly. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The small social muscles that form in adolescence, practice at conflict and repair, remained underused. By 16, Harvard accepted him. The achievement looked like a doorway to a life of the mind, but the life behind that door was indifferent. Dorm life offered anonymity and noise, little warmth. He moved through lecture halls where professors spoke at altitude, and students formed circles that tightened quickly around shared background and confidence. He had neither. Age mattered, social experience mattered, and there he was, advanced on paper, underdeveloped where it counts for cohesion. Routines surfaced to replace connection. Library, class, room, meals at off hours to avoid crowds. A body still growing, a mind in overdrive, a nervous system managing constant novelty without anchor. He was not a misfit by choice. He was a precise result of layered decisions that valued performance and neglected integration. In hindsight, the pattern reads clearly: competence without belonging, autonomy without support. The psychology of the moment is important here too. Praise kept arriving, but only for outcomes, grades, placement, speed. Nobody scaled praise to the cost. The idea that intellect can substitute for intimacy began to calcify. He learned to mute needs and frame discomfort as weakness. What question would you ask a teenager here? Maybe this: if nobody reflects back your humanity, do you start to erase it yourself? Family visits offered relief and confusion. His mother encouraged him, sent letters, saved clippings, and tried to bridge distance with presence on paper. His father, proud but unsentimental, saw a son moving toward promise. The household they built had no map for a child running far ahead academically while freezing up socially. Support was real, but it spoke the language of achievement, not attachment. Small humiliations accumulate. A joke missed, a study group that forgets to call, a professor who never learns your name. He built a life of circumscribed movement from safe space to safe space, relying on the predictability of schedules and the clarity of problems with answers. Yet a counterforce formed, resentment toward the ambient chaos of other people and toward institutions that celebrated him while leaving him invisible. What stands out now in retrospect is the early seed of erasure, not a disappearance from records, but a gradual vanishing from ordinary life. The skills sharpened, the person withdrew. Harvard opened doors, yes, but it also opened the door to something else. Down a corridor beneath the title of research, behind a polite invitation to participate, sat an experiment that would take his already fragile trust and put it under stress. The invitation looked routine, a study on stress and achievement, compensation offered, time blocked in a quiet room. At Harvard, compliance with research requests felt like part of the culture. He signed the forms, wrote the autobiographical essays they asked for beliefs, ambitions, private doubts, and handed them over. What he did not know was that those pages would be weaponized back at him, filmed and dissected under lighting that flattened faces and magnified strain. The protocol belonged to psychologist Henry Murray, whose interests included personality under pressure. Sessions unfolded as confrontations, not conversations. The subject sat, wired by expectation, while across the table, a trained interrogator attacked the text, the logic, and the person who wrote it. Words that had read like honest introspection became vulnerabilities to exploit. The tone was surgical. The goal was to destabilize and record how he coped. Stakes here were quiet but severe. Identity under assault, trust in institutions eroding in a young mind already stretched thin. The psychology of the moment is important. If you are 19, accelerated and isolated, and a revered institution invites you into a lab, you assume safety. Instead, he learned a new lesson. Authority could humiliate, and call it science. Each weekly return reinforced the bind: endure or quit and feel weak. Action took the form of repetition. He showed up, was told to sit straight, to look, to answer. Essays he had labored over were read back in a mocking cadence. A camera rolled. The interrogator pushed contradictions, suggested cowardice, accused him of dishonesty, then pivoted and praised, only to undercut the praise moments later. It was an engineered whiplash meant to provoke. He tried to counter with logic, precision, and distance, but the format rewarded neither fairness nor truth, only reaction. Humiliation was framed as data. In hindsight, it matters that everything was staged like a machine: intake, stimulus, response, transcription. The language of domination and control, inputs, outputs, conditioning would appear later in his writing, a bitter echo of these rooms. What nobody knew at the time, or cared to measure, was the residue this leaves. The way it teaches that systems do not see you, they process you. Impact accumulated slowly. Resentment toward authority sharpened. He began to split people from structures in his thinking, seeing individuals as pawns of systems that used them. "Attack the mechanism, not the operator," is not a direct quote, but the idea tracks closely with arguments he would later make. Institutions are the threat because they amplify power without accountability. The experiment offered a template for targeting systems, not just people. Meanwhile, his daily life remained austere and cyclical: library, class, room. The study added a concealed hostility to that cycle. He carried the aftertaste of being handled. The research did not create the isolation, but it concentrated it. To a mind that prized order, this was proof that institutions violated their own claims about ethics and care. He filed the lesson away, like a theorem. Authority justifies harm if it serves an outcome. There is a clinical analogy worth noting. In engineering, repeated stress below a breaking point still induces fatigue. Microfractures accumulate until failure. These sessions acted that way. No single meeting shattered him. The series weakened trust, strained coping, and encouraged retreat. And yet, for all this, he kept returning, which tells you about his commitment to endure and about the social calculus that told him quitting would be its own humiliation. What stands out now in retrospect is how belief formation happened through injury. He did not emerge with a single epiphany. He built a worldview from abrasions. Institutions were machines. Machines erased people. Therefore, survival required resistance. The research team got their measurements. He got a story about power that would later justify cruelty as defense. When the experiment ended, graduate school started to look less like advancement and more like escape. Another system, Yes, but one with the promise of distance from the lab's glare. He arrived at Berkeley with a reputation that travelled ahead of him, a quiet prodigy stepping into a department that prized rigour and elegance. Mathematics at this level is both language and landscape, and he moved inside it with ease. Colleagues noted competence bordering on brilliance, differential equations, complex analysis, proofs that landed cleanly, no flourish, just control. On paper, a seamless progression from Harvard to graduate excellence to elite faculty ranks. But here is the twist. Teaching is not proof, it is contact. In classrooms, he stood stiff at the board, wrote quickly, seldom turned to read the room. Students needed translation, metaphors, patience. He offered accuracy, speed, and distance. Office hours were brief, transactional. Small questions irritated him. He answered them, but the tone carried a message. Meet me at altitude, or fall away. The social work of teaching, coaxing, sensing confusion, slowing down never became natural. The psychology of the moment is important. He believed that substance should override style, that the right solution delivered cleanly was the whole job. Instead, he confronted a truth that felt like an insult. In a university, clarity is relational. He could not tolerate the noise that relation produces, misunderstandings, repetition, the heat of personalities crowding a small room. A semester became a countdown. He retreated into solitude between lectures, avoided colleagues, and let the department become corridors, not community. Yet his research moved forward. Early publications drew respect, not fanfare. He was the kind of mathematician who built without spectacle, careful lines, strong joints, no ornament. Letters of recommendation, had they been needed, would have read like this: technically gifted, self-contained, difficult to place in collaborative settings. The tension gathered quietly. He had achieved the scenario most gifted students are told to want, and it felt like confinement. Then came the resignation. No scandal, no loud break, just a decision that landed with the weight of finality. He informed the department, returned keys, left a box of papers for the next instructor, and walked away. Microstory. An empty office, chalk dust still on the tray, a stapler in the drawer, a desk cleared except for a single key. Facilities would find it and wonder about the abruptness, the neatness, the absence of residue. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery to outsiders, but the pattern aligns. He stripped his life to essentials, not out of romantic austerity, but as a controlled variable. In hindsight, this was the pivot from ambition to withdrawal. The metrics that once anchored him, grades, publications, titles, were discarded. He told himself he was leaving the machine. In truth, he was leaving the last structured place that still expected him to face people. Family watched, concerned. His mother framed the departure as a pause, a recalibration. His father, pragmatic, saw a waste of earned position. They lacked leverage. He was not drifting, he was executing. The plan, if you can call it that, was subtraction. Remove obligations, remove noise, remove witnesses to the erosion of ordinary life. He did not announce a new goal. He made room for one. And then there was the geography. Withdrawal was not enough within city limits. He looked for edges on the map, places with long winters and short lists of neighbours. The logic was precise. Reduce inputs, reduce demand, reclaim control. The move he contemplated was not a retreat to heal. It was a redesign of existence to prevent contact from reshaping him again. What stands out now in retrospect is the certainty with which he closed the door. Promise was not lost to failure. It was abandoned by choice. The exit carried a belief that the world's terms were intolerable, that purity required distance. He would go looking for a place to disappear, not to become no one, but to become the only one in the room whose rules mattered. He chose Lincoln, Montana, because it offered two currencies he valued above all else: silence and control. He built the cabin by hand, a one-room box of rough boards and intention. No electricity, no plumbing, a small window to ration light, a wood stove in the corner that set the rhythm of every day. The footprint was deliberate. Limited space meant limited variables. In a world he believed pushed and pulled people without consent, this was a closed system he could govern. Routine became the scaffold. Mornings started with splitting wood, hauling water, checking traps along narrow paths he knew like proofs. Gardening followed the seasons. Potatoes, beets, hardy greens, planted in neat rows, hedged against late frosts. He read in long, uninterrupted stretches, a stack of mathematics beside survival manuals and social theory. Then he wrote, Journals, drafts, arguments, tight handwriting that tucked emotion behind analysis. The psychology of the moment is important. Ritual stabilized a mind that distrusted drift, but the perimeter wasn't absolute. He noticed more trucks on the county road, more tourists in summer, new game trails broken by human scent. And then there was the favorite place, an alpine pocket he considered sacred for its quiet, cut open by a new road. He hiked up, expecting the old solitude, and found machinery scars instead. For most people, the anger would cool. For him, it hardened into a grievance that read like an equation. Intrusion equals violence. Therefore, retaliation equals defense. He pursued self-sufficiency with a precision that doubled as training. Scavenged metal became workable stock. He studied chemistry from old texts, not the grand sweep of theory, but the sections that explained reactions and stability. He tested small mixtures outdoors, far from the cabin, burying residues, learning wind patterns to carry away telltale odors. He practiced anti-forensic habits as if they were wilderness skills. Erase footprints, vary routes, handle components with gloves, wash tools in lye to blur fingerprints, file off serial numbers, sand wood to disrupt unique tool marks. Early devices misfired. A switch failed to close, a battery drained in cold, a pressure trigger deformed under transport. He treated each failure as data. He built jigs, simple wooden fixtures, to cut grooves precisely, to seat end caps snugly, to guide drill bits true. He refined igniters, trying different filaments, different contact pressures, testing how vibration during mailing might shift components. The action felt clinical. The goal wasn't spectacle, it was reliability. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery to neighbors who remembered him as the thin man on a bicycle. Meanwhile, on his desk, the letters lengthened. He began drafting arguments that cast technology not as tools, but as a system with appetite, a machine that demanded conformity and consumed landscapes and minds. He argued that returning to pre-industrial life was the only protection, framing modern suffering as a byproduct of a gear turning without pause. The analogy he reached for was mechanical. Feed a circuit enough heat and it fails. Feed a society enough complexity and it collapses. Trigger events accumulated. A neighbor's generator throbbed through the timber. Chainsaws bit mornings into pieces. Survey flags appeared like warnings that other lines would be drawn soon. Each flag felt like a trespass, then a threat. He told himself the balance had tipped, that passivity was complicity. In hindsight, this is where grievance turned to weaponization. Not overnight, but step by measured step, with the same method he used to plant potatoes in straight rows. He also built defenses against detection. He studied handwriting guides and forced himself into block letters with odd spacing, then shifted to a typewriter to normalize output. He learned postal rates, stamped packages with combinations that looked plausible but masked origin, used false return addresses tied to real institutions to blend in. He handled inner components with improvised tweezers, stored finished boards wrapped in waxed paper to resist moisture and fingerprints. What nobody knew at the time was that these small, careful habits, practiced in isolation, formed a lattice strong enough to carry devices across the country. Yet loneliness didn't vanish inside mastery. Winter nights stretched, the stove clicked as metal expanded and cooled. He wrote about hunger, not for food, but for quiet that would last, for a halt to what he saw as an advancing grid. He interpreted each distant engine as evidence, each newspaper story about a new development as indictment. The world, in his writing, narrowed to two categories: those who advanced the machine and those who resisted. Here's where the pivot becomes clear. Letters began to travel farther than he did. The cabin produced words and objects, arguments and mechanisms, both designed to leave Montana and arrive unannounced. The act of sending them completed a circuit he'd been testing for years, the belief that violence could communicate where language alone failed. And while his daily life looked static to anyone passing the clearing, inside, the process accelerated. Refine, prepare, ship, and wait for the news that would confirm not only the blast, but the thesis he needed the world to witness. The bombing campaign. Escalation. Craft and victims. His targets said more about ideas than grudges. Universities, airlines, computer scientists, geneticists, advertising executives. The selection mapped a worldview where institutions that amplified technology were nodes in a hostile network. He stayed nameless, let the devices speak, and signed them FC for Freedom Club, a fiction constructed to look like a small cell. The psychology of the moment is important. He wanted symbolism to carry, for each blast to echo against the system he believed was erasing people without a trace. Device signatures hardened into a vocabulary. Wood casings, carefully planed, dovetailed, and stained to look like harmless parcels. End caps fitted with a joiner's precision. Carved initials embedded not as vanity, but as misdirection. He used false return addresses that exploited academic trust. Professors mailing professors, departments mailing departments, making campus mailrooms, the unwitting conveyor belts. Booby traps punished curiosity. A false lid wired to a switch, a fishing line anchored to a hidden trigger that snapped when a package lifted, pressure plates that completed a circuit when a box was set down. And then there was the airline episode. A device placed to detonate mid-flight by exploiting cabin pressure and barometric change. It failed to destroy the plane, but it forced an unprecedented response, because the potential loss scaled from individual victims to mass casualty. The federal focus intensified. Aviation authorities rewrote protocols. The FBI created a dedicated task force, and the media coined a name that stuck because it was accurate to the targets: Unabomber, universities and airlines, shortened into a grim brand, the Unabomber. Victims gave the story its human outline. In 1985, Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner, discovered a package in the parking lot. He approached, the device detonated, and he was killed. Years later, in 1994, Thomas Mosser, an advertising executive, died in his home after opening a parcel. His wife and child were upstairs. In 1995, Gilbert Murray, a Forestry Association president, opened a package delivered to his office. It killed him instantly. Survivors carried devastating injuries: hands torn apart, eyes damaged, faces reconstructed, lives rerouted by trauma and chronic pain. Each incident expanded the ring of fear, from individual households to entire professional communities. He staged and deceived with care. Sometimes he planted clues that led nowhere. Metal tags stamped with cryptic letters, components altered to imply different origins, typography tweaked between letters to simulate multiple authors. He introduced intentional errors to confuse profilers, a misspelling he'd corrected elsewhere, a slang term inconsistent with his education, a reference that pointed geographically away from Montana. Meanwhile, he kept constants that would later convict him, because craft leaves its own trace. In hindsight, his control met its limitation. Pattern is both camouflage and signature. Stakes rose quietly, then loudly. Academic mailrooms became ritualized choke points. Clerks learned to weigh parcels by hand, to check for wires under flaps, to log unusual odors or stains. Professors warned assistants not to open unexpected packages. Secretaries managed their own anxiety, balancing efficiency with survival. Postal workers, now on the invisible front line, absorbed the dread. The chilling mystery became part of campus life. Any package could be a test. The FBI, under pressure, rotated agents through long shifts, built databases of components, mapped postal routes, and knocked on doors that yielded nothing. Media attention created a second battlefield. He leveraged it, releasing letters that taunted investigators and threatened more violence unless newspapers published his manifesto. The Washington Post, with the New York Times involved, ultimately ran the essay at the FBI's request, hoping someone would recognize the voice. But before that recognition, the devices kept coming, each one a proof of concept refined from the last. Anti-tracking tricks remained diligent, glue types consistent yet generic, nails chosen from common stock to avoid unique metallurgy, wood sanded to blur tool marks, postage that muddied origin. What stands out now in retrospect is his iterative discipline. Early units relied on simple battery and switch configurations vulnerable to cold and vibration. Later, he stabilized circuits, padded components against shock, and used more reliable ignition sources. He learned to mask scents with solvent and smoke, to store finished devices in sealed containers to minimize corrosion, and to test mechanical tolerances with jigs until repeatable. This is the method of an engineer without a lab: fail, note, adjust, retest. It's also the method of a stalker who replaces empathy with procedure. Meanwhile, the victim's circles stretched into long shadows. A graduate student who handled mail developed nightly panic, scanning every object for hidden seams. A receptionist kept a pair of gardening gloves in her drawer, unable to touch cardstock bare-handed. Survivors navigated rehab clinics, prosthetics, fittings, ophthalmology wards lit too bright. The public often remembers names attached to headlines. Families remember the mundane logistics of living with injury. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In bombing cases, silence is replaced by noise that never stops. He also used geography as a prop. Some devices were deliberately mailed from locations far from Montana, likely to obfuscate his base. Others contained components common to national chains, denying investigators a regional supply clue. He kept his own travel minimal, relying on postal complexity as cover. The system he despised became the vector for his violence, a contradiction he'd try to resolve rhetorically by claiming necessity. The FBI's profile evolved under pressure. Early sketches leaned blue-collar. The technical precision and ideological framing suggested otherwise. Forensic evidence pulled in multiple directions, homemade woodwork that signaled hands-on aptitude, chemical choices that signaled study, rhetoric that signaled an autodidact philosopher. But here's the twist. Even as the case name hardened and the task force expanded, the break didn't come from a lab bench. It came from a living room, from a brother reading a published essay and hearing family language ring through it. Impact accumulated, and the label Unabomber moved from newsroom shorthand to a public fixture, a synonym for mailed terror. Pressure mounted on investigators to end the campaign cleanly. Campuses normalized hypervigilance, installing metal detectors, rewriting mail protocols, and accepting a baseline anxiety that would outlast the case. While his devices spoke through shrapnel and smoke, his words were preparing to travel further than any package. He was ready to argue in plain language that the system itself was the bomb, and that his blasts were only alarms. He wrote it as a demand and a diagnosis, insisting that newspapers publish or face more violence. Editors weighed risk against duty, consulted the FBI, and measured whether printing a text linked to murder could prevent further deaths. The decision landed. Run the essay, hope the voice would be recognized, and accept the ethical weight. What stands out now in retrospect is how the text aimed to turn fear into attention, and attention into validation. The core thesis was stark. Technology, he argued, wasn't a neutral set of tools but a system, an organism that reorganized human life around its needs. Industrial society produced abundance while eroding autonomy, extracting obedience through jobs, schedules, and surveillance. He wrote that freedom required living within small, direct systems, food, shelter, craft, rather than networks of expertise that made individuals dependent. The psychology of the moment is important. He framed anxiety, depression, and social fragmentation as byproducts of complexity, not individual weakness. He positioned progress as a trap. New devices didn't provide choice. They created new baselines that compelled adoption. Refuse and risk exclusion, accept and surrender control. He called this the power process, the need for meaningful work that individuals could plan and execute with real stakes. He claimed modern life replaced this with artificial surrogates, entertainment, consumer goals, bureaucratic success. The argument carried a mechanical analogy. A circuit heated by constant load doesn't explode immediately. It drifts toward failure, piece by piece. But here's the twist. He used violence to force the reading. The document didn't arrive as an idea among ideas. It rode in on detonations. That move poisoned reception and revealed something about motive. Was the text a cause or a justification built around long-standing grievance? Investigators considered both. Meanwhile, readers confronted a strange collision, a fluent critique of industrial harms linked to mailed carnage. Linguistic fingerprints threaded through the pages. He used idioms his family recognized, phrasing like, "You can't eat your cake and have it too," a construction their mother had repeated. Rhythm, punctuation, and certain word choices, old-fashioned in places, pedantic in others, stood out. He wrote Negro rather than contemporary terms, avoided contractions at times, and leaned on precise, sometimes archaic diction. Patterns matched earlier letters sent to newspapers and academics. The voice was a lattice no one else used. At a kitchen table, David Kaczynski and his wife underlined those echoes. They remembered letters Ted had mailed home, the same cadence, the same disdain for technophiles, the same insistence that modernity deformed the soul. They faced an ethical fracture that few can imagine. Protect a brother whose intellect they admired and whose suffering they feared, or call authorities to stop a killer. They sought counsel, brought writing samples to an attorney, then to the FBI. The choice didn't end with the call. It began there, with fallout that would never finish. Public reactions split along predictable lines. Some readers felt a flash of recognition at the critique, the sense that something in modern life grinds people down. Most saw the obvious. Ideas joined to murder don't earn legitimacy. Newspapers ran the text with disclaimers, opinion pages filled with condemnation and wary engagement. Academics passed arguments, ethicists warned against platforming violence, and victims' families watched as the man who killed their loved ones tried to seize the final word. The manifesto's impact on the investigation was immediate. Analysts coded the prose, linked turns of phrase to earlier documents, and matched argument structures to unpublished essays. Typewritten quirks, spacing, pressure, character wear, narrowed possibilities. The search shifted from parts to prose, from nails and switches to syntax. A suspect profile tightened. Educated, solitary, steeped in certain strains of political philosophy, perhaps with a background in mathematics or logic given the structured argumentation. He presented the document as a practical blueprint. Dismantle industrial society, return to smaller, resilient communities, accept lower material standards for higher autonomy. He warned that reforms wouldn't work because systems seek equilibrium and growth. Yet he offered little about transition beyond rupture and nothing about consent. Violence, he insisted, was a lever. That insistence betrayed the empathy deficit at the core of his method. He wanted to preserve human dignity by removing human choice. Meanwhile, the newspapers absorbed the consequences. Staff fielded threats, readers wrote furious letters, and editors defended the decision as a calculated risk endorsed by law enforcement. The FBI took calls by the thousands. Among them, one voice mattered most: David's. Recognition turned the theoretical into the personal, and the personal into a lead that would end the case. What happened next moved from the page to the door of a cabin. Identification was one thing, bringing him in alive was another. The manifesto had been his loudest act of control. Soon, control would pass to a warrant, a team, and a silent approach through snow and timber toward a room where drafts, tools, and a typewriter waited to testify. The earliest profile leaned the wrong way. Investigators pictured a blue-collar tinkerer, a disgruntled mechanic with a grudge, because the woodwork looked handmade and the circuits were simple. What stands out now in retrospect is that simplicity masked sophistication. The devices were engineered to pass through systems, not to impress experts. As injuries mounted, the profile shifted. Older, educated, solitary, comfortable with abstraction, disciplined enough to iterate without boasting. But here's the twist. Parallel teams reached conflicting conclusions. Some read the rhetoric and saw a social conservative. Others saw a primitivist with academic pedigree. The psychology of the moment is important. Uncertainty bred pressure, and pressure breeds mistakes. Letters to newspapers were combed for regionalisms. None landed. Toolmark databases were built. The wooden casings blunted specificity. Chemical signatures suggested hardware store sourcing, which meant anyone, anywhere. Years passed under fluorescent light, caseboards thick with string and photos, momentum constantly at risk. Evidence still accumulated. Postal inspectors mapped routes, tracked cancellation marks, and looked for clusters of mailings that could point to a hub. Forensic examiners compared nail stock by metallurgy, traced batteries by manufacturer lot, and scanned paper fibers for mill identifiers. Handwriting analysts had little to hold. Block letters disguised natural motion. Typewriting analysts found more: character wear patterns, line spacing irregularities, and a distinctive strike on certain capitals that hinted at a particular make and era of machine. Meanwhile, a new discipline matured inside the task force: forensic linguistics. Analysts broke the letters and manifesto into tokens, function words, syntax, preferred constructions. They catalogued archaic diction, the stubborn, "you can't eat your cake and have it too," and an unusual cadence that mixed formal exposition with didactic admonitions. This wasn't just ideology, it was idiolect, a personal dialect. The theory was simple and powerful. Writing as a fingerprint. Investigators also sifted older, obscure publications that echoed the manifesto's arguments. A librarian flagged an essay from years earlier with matching turns of phrase. A professor remembered a crank letter that attacked technology using near-identical logic. Threads converged. The manifesto's publication multiplied the public's eyes, but the break didn't come from a stranger. It came from a kitchen table where those patterns were family. David Kaczynski, guided by an attorney, approached the FBI with samples. The Bureau ran blind comparisons. Analysts who didn't know the source assessed similarity across grammar, vocabulary, and argument structure. Overlaps were striking. Where the Unabomber wrote leftists in a specific, sweeping manner, the samples did too. Where he avoided certain contractions, so did the samples. Where he preferred broadly speaking as a hedge, the samples matched. The statistical weight wasn't courtroom proof yet, but it was enough to pivot. Agents tightened the net. They linked travel records to historical mailing windows, noted that suspicious mail sometimes originated in cities reachable by bus from Montana, and overlaid hunting seasons with lulls in activity. Practical constraints, weather, terrain, cash, began to outline a life. A warrant team started planning around worst-case scenarios, booby traps on doors, deadfalls in the brush, a suspect who might prefer suicide to capture. Psychological containment mattered as much as perimeter. Surprises had to be minimized to prevent a final act of violence. The affidavit stacked layers, linguistic concordance, typewriter peculiarities, aligned with seized letters, ideological continuity across years, and the family identification. A judge signed. The raid plan set entry angles, medics on standby, a bomb tech at the elbow of the point team, and a quiet approach calibrated to catch a mind that valued control completely off balance. The door opened. The life inside was organized around violence and order. The errors had finally yielded to the breakthrough that language promised from the start. The voice that mailed bombs could not stop sounding like itself. The room was smaller than the legend, 8 by 10 in feel, air-packed with the mixed scents of wood smoke, solvent, and old paper, shelves bowed under books, primitive technology, mathematics, botany, anthropology, chemistry handbooks, and a scattering of political tracts worn at the spine. On the table, a manual typewriter waited, ribbon dark, keys with distinct wear that examiners would map like a coastline. Nearby, a tin of stamps, sorted, not by denomination alone, but by postmark habits, dates, and likely scrutiny. Inventory started as triage, then became pattern. A cardboard box held nails grouped by length and head shape in labelled envelopes, the labels hand-cut, corners trimmed, an economy of movement made visible. There were lengths of copper wire twisted neatly, batteries stored away from metal, a roll of fishing line, fittings, threaded rods, small springs, each in its own container, each tagged with a scrap noting source and performance. Precision was not decoration, it was doctrine. The workbench told the clearest story. Jigs fashioned from pine and maple guided cuts and bores so that wood casings fit tight, seams aligned, lids closed without detectable play. A dowel with a notch became a gauge for setting switch clearance. A block drilled at specific angles kept vent holes consistent. There was a scribe line etched into the bench top at a standard measurement, burnished by repetition. This was production without an assembly line, craftsmanship harnessed to harm. Agents found triggers in stages, early designs using simple pressure closures, later ones resorting to more stable, shock-resistant mechanisms. A pressure plate constructed from 2 thin plywood sheets, separated by spacers, wired to complete a circuit when weight collapsed the gap. A spring-loaded latch, primed by removing a pin, concealed beneath a false lid. Contacts fashioned from razor-thin foil so that the slightest shift would bridge them. The progression mapped as clearly as a lab notebook would have. The journals were the anchor. Not diaries, but ledgers of method and motive. Dates aligned with test results and mailed parcels. Entries used a clipped, almost clinical tone. Weather recorded because cold changed battery behavior. Humidity noted because adhesives cured differently. There were self-justifications threaded between voltage calculations and postal schedules, arguments about necessity and the language of siege, defense, encroachment, purity, contamination. The handwriting stayed even, the spacing tight, emotion pressed into logic. Forensic mapping began in the first hour. Fingerprints, lifted from surfaces that had not been washed in lye or smoke, partials on glass jars, ridge detail on the underside of a shelf, too awkward to scrub. Wood grain analysis would later match saw kerf patterns to fragments from prior blasts. Tool marks on cut ends bore the same micro-chatter, a unique vibration signature from a particular hand file. Adhesive residues, a consistent formulation of glue, reappeared, like a watermark across time. In a crate, draft sections of the manifesto showed edits in layers, margins crowded with addenda that circled back to earlier themes. Certain phrases appeared, crossed out, rewritten, then restored with only a single word changed, an obsession with cadence as much as claim. Typewriter impressions matched outgoing letters, the same faint strike on capital T, the same subtle misalignment on the lowercase e. Analysts smiled grimly. These were threads you could pull without breaking. Mailing lists were unexpected and damning. Not merely addresses, but clusters, departments, labs, individuals flagged by role, not by name recognition. Notes marked which targets amplified technological change and which represented symbolic pressure points. He studied university directories, association rosters, trade publications, and annotated them with arrows, checks, and a private taxonomy of risk and reward. The machine he hated had provided the map. He had copied it by hand. There were anti-tracking measures, almost habitual, glass jars washed until squeak clean, lids wiped with solvent, rags burned in the stove, stamps licked sparingly or applied with a damp cloth, paper handled with tweezers in places, then folded by tools that left uniform creases, postage patterns designed to approximate the weight without inviting hand weighing at counters. He logged which branches were less busy, which clerks asked fewer questions, a sociology of evasion captured in shorthand. Handwriting samples existed only in practice sheets, as if he had trained his arm out of its natural curves. Block letters at even height, spacing deliberately odd, an unnatural rightward drift introduced and then moderated. When he switched to type, he left those sheets behind like shed skin. Investigators would later use them as a negative image, proof of a deliberate erasure of biometrics, staging the absence as strategy. In a corner, a box of salvaged electronics, cannibalized from radios and appliances, offered coils, capacitors, housings. He had tested, learned failure modes, and kept what worked in cold, in vibration, in motion. He used waxed paper to wrap delicate parts, preventing moisture from wicking in during transit. He labeled these with terse codes, season, test number, outcome, and cross, referenced them in the journals, a private index that made sense, only with both in hand. Books were not trophies. They were scaffolding, a volume on metallurgy with dog-eared pages where nail hardness and brittleness met, a postal guide annotated at margins on rate changes, older chemistry texts that explained formulations in straightforward terms, more practical than modern, less guarded with detail. A primer on small engine repair, not for engines, but for fasteners and materials. He curated knowledge to serve a narrow purpose, subtracting anything that did not feed the work. The stove, its iron belly blackened, held remains of burned paper, edges of charts, a char line through what might have been a list. Even the ash told a story. Bombtex sifted it, recovered partial characters, reconstructed a date that coincided with a lull in mailings. The psychology of the moment is important. He paused sometimes, not from doubt, but to recalibrate. Even restraint became part of the method. He lived inside order and prepared for chaos elsewhere. Clothes folded, canned goods stacked with labels facing a single direction, a knife sharpened to a narrow bevel, a whetstone worn to a shallow dish. A bicycle leaned against the wall, tires scuffed but inflated, a practical radius of movement preserved. There were no photographs. Erasure was not symbolic. It was enforced, a refusal to let faces revisit the room. When agents finished the sweep, the narrative assembled itself, not through confession, but through consonance. The cabin was an archive of intention, workbench to journal, type slug to letter, jig to fragment, glue to residue. The artifacts insisted on a single conclusion. This was a war against technology, fought with technology's byproducts. A paradox he tried to resolve by calling it necessity. Court would decide whether the mind at this bench was disordered or doctrinaire. He would reject both labels, insist the artifacts were arguments, and ask the system he despised to read them. Jail replaced timber with concrete, silence with controlled noise. He asked to represent himself, wanting the courtroom to become a lectern for his critique, but competency stood in the way. Defense counsel prepared a mental illness strategy that might spare him the death penalty, framing his life as a lattice of isolation, trauma, and delusional fixation. He rejected that frame, insisting his choices were rational, his targets symbolic, his violence constrained by purpose, not impulse. The psychology of the moment is important. To accept severe mental illness as defense would mean surrendering authorship of his ideology. He refused evaluations that pinned grandiosity or paranoia to his pages. arguing that diagnostic language was just another system's vocabulary of control. Prosecutors, meanwhile, treated ideology as motive, not mitigation. They advanced victims' names, injuries, and the deliberate engineering that produced lethal outcomes, evidence that premeditation eclipsed any claim of diminished capacity. Hearings became battlegrounds over identity. Could he waive counsel? Could he sabotage a mental health defense designed to save his life? The judge had to balance autonomy with fairness, wary that a defendant might orchestrate his own death sentence by refusing the only viable path to mercy. Experts filed reports under seal. Prosecutors lined up physical evidence like iron filings around a magnet, typewriter correlations, wood grain matches, jig marks, adhesive consistency, journal entries, syncing dates, and postal windows. Victim impact statements arrived early in the process, as if the courtroom needed a spine. A widow described the sound before silence, the way a package turned a hallway into a wound. A survivor recounted surgeries stacked across years, risk calculations attached to daily tasks, prosthetic fittings, phantom pain. Their voices cut through theory. Ideology did not reattach fingers, did not return fathers. The system, for all its flaws, existed to weigh harm and impose consequence. Here, consequence was expected to be absolute. But here is the twist. He feared a courtroom narrative that pathologized him more than he feared life in a small cell. Negotiations surfaced. A plea could remove the death penalty from the table, lock in life without parole, and avoid a trial that would turn into a referendum on sanity. He resisted language that implied sickness, pushed for documents that preserved his political identity, even if only as a footnote. The government, focused on certainty and finality, made the offer: plead guilty to all counts, accept multiple life sentences, and the state would not seek death. He read the agreement like a technical document, scrutinizing the clauses for traps. Counsel pressed the human arithmetic. A plea keeps you alive, a trial risks execution, and a diagnosis you despise may be uttered anyway when experts testify. In the end, he entered the plea. The courtroom heard the words, clear, controlled. He accepted guilt for a series of bombings conducted over years, acknowledged deaths and injuries, and yielded the rest of his life to custody. Impact rippled in unexpected ways. Families gained closure without the prolonged spectacle of a capital trial. Investigators, many of whom had spent careers under the case's weight, exhaled. The public witnessed a paradox resolved by pragmatism. A man who had spent 2 decades rejecting systems accepted the system's harshest stable outcome to preserve control over his identity. He had avoided death by law while engineering a different kind of erasure, a permanent removal from ordinary time. Prison narrowed his world further, from a forest clearing to a cell measured in strides. He maintained routines, reading, correspondence, precise notes, turning monotony into ritual. He wrote essays that resisted psychiatric labels, critiqued media coverage, and revisited arguments from the manifesto, stripped of the leverage of bombs. Other prisoners became background noise. Guards, procedures, and counts became the clock. He navigated the bureaucracy like terrain, filing grievances, negotiating property limits, calculating the small freedoms available. Public meaning evolved. Scholars debated whether the manifesto's themes, alienation, technological dependence, ecological harm, could be separated from the violence that broadcast them. Many argued that any resonance owed everything to context. The arguments were not novel, only loud. Others used the text cautiously in classrooms, not to elevate its author, but to dissect how grievance becomes ideology, and how ideology can rationalize cruelty as remedy. Ethics committees cited the publication decision as a case study in risk, duty, and the unintended consequences of platforming. Victim narratives moved to the foreground, as they should. Memorials named the dead, annual gatherings marked survival, and workplaces codified protocols born from fear into durable safety habits. The FBI archived the case as both caution and instruction, a reminder that linguistic evidence can break stalemates and that profiles are hypotheses, not verdicts. In hindsight, investigators acknowledged misreads and the grind of uncertainty, but they also underscored the value of patience, cross-disciplinary work, and a family's courage. He aged. Transfers shifted him through facilities, from higher security to medical units when needed. He kept writing, sometimes to deny, sometimes to argue, sometimes to pick fights with labels he could not control. Letters arrived from sympathizers and critics. He answered selectively, often with didactic tone, rejecting pity and insisting on the logic of his stance. The cell remained spare, a mirror of the cabin's austerity without its autonomy, the difference between self-imposed hardship and imposed confinement. Meanwhile, the cultural shorthand hardened. Unabomber became a reference point for mailroom anxiety, a metaphor misused in headlines to suggest anonymous disruption. Documentaries revisited the case, sometimes exaggerating the cabin's mystique, sometimes focusing properly on victims and the brothers' unbearable decision. The Harvard experiments drew renewed scrutiny, not as cause, but as context for how institutions can wound while measuring. Ethical frameworks in research cited the case as a dark reminder to treat participants as people, not inputs. Authorities later reported his death in custody. The announcement closed a procedural chapter but did not resolve the questions that orbit the story. Can ideology ever be disentangled from the psychology that carries it? When does grievance cross the line into a totalizing worldview that sanctions erasure? The psychology of the moment is important, even now. He wanted the last word. The system denied that, not by argument, but by outlasting him. In the aftermath, three truths stand together. First, the violence ended because a family listened to language and chose responsibility over loyalty. Second, the investigation succeeded because disciplines cooperated, accepting that a single detail, syntax, a type slug, a jig, can unlock a case stalled by myth. Third, the victims' lives, altered irrevocably, demand that any telling centers harm, not the fragile glamour of a hermit's creed. The psychology of grievance rarely forms in a vacuum. Isolation primes the mind to search for frameworks that make pain legible, and ideology offers a clean diagram. Villains, mechanisms, solutions. In his case, distance hardened into certainty. He treated discomfort as evidence, then elevated evidence into doctrine. What stands out now in retrospect is that ideology did not create loneliness, it weaponized it, giving isolation a mission and cruelty a rationale. Institutional harm can act like an accelerant. The Harvard experiments did not dictate his future, but they modeled domination behind polite walls, teaching a lesson about power that he later amplified. Graduate life and academic indifference added friction. None of this excuses what followed. It explains how stressors aligned, how small fractures became fault lines. Responsibility still rests where decisions were made, at a desk, with tools and stamps, in a cabin arranged around harm. Think of systems as feedback loops. Each act reinforced the next. A successful detonation produced headlines. Headlines validated the thesis that technology spread anxiety and control. Validation justified escalation. Like a circuit heating under load, the loop tightened until failure, arrest, prison, a life compressed. In hindsight, an alternate loop was available: intervention, treatment, or human contact that did not route through humiliation or performance. Those options flickered, but pride and rigidity kept the switch open. There is a caution here about platforming violent manifestos. Publishing the document helped identification, arguably prevented more deaths, yet it also granted reach. The ethical lesson is narrow and specific. When violence forces attention, institutions must minimize amplification while maximizing investigative benefit, framing the text with context, centering victims, and refusing to launder arguments through aesthetics or novelty. Ideas tied to carnage arrive contaminated. Treat them as evidence, not doctrine. Early intervention matters. Gifted children are not immune to social corrosion. Acceleration without belonging teaches a trade. Brilliance for connection. Schools can pair advanced work with mentorship that values attachment, not just output. Research ethics must guard against clever cruelty, remembering that participants are people, not instruments. Families facing troubling ideation need accessible pathways to support that do not convert concern into catastrophe. Agency complicates empathy. We can acknowledge pressure points, experiments, social vacuum, institutional coldness, without erasing the hand that taped wires and sealed boxes. Empathy belongs to victims first, then to communities that absorbed fear, then to families who chose duty over blood. The rest of us should watch how narratives sanctify harm, especially stories that dress violence in philosophy. A calm voice, precise arguments, and a handcrafted device are not sophistication, they are staging. What if we treat grievance like weather, and agency like shelter? Storms arrive, but construction standards determine collapse. Strengthening standards means teaching, coping without contempt, dissent without dehumanization, Critique without coercion. It means building systems that correct themselves before heat builds to failure. And it means remembering a simple boundary. The moment an idea demands a body to prove its point, the idea belongs in evidence, not in the canon. Let's get to story number 2. In the calm heart of an English suburb, Evil wore a stethoscope. There was no remote cabin, no manifesto, no warning signs visible to those who trusted him most. Harold Shipman, the family doctor whose visits once brought comfort to living rooms across Hyde, turned medicine's most sacred promise to heal into a disguise. His tools were ordinary: a syringe, a pen, a signature. His victims were neighbors, parents, grandparents, patients who saw reassurance in his steady manner. What police uncovered in the late 1990s was not a single crime, but a pattern woven through years of care, forged trust, falsified records, and the quiet weaponization of authority. It began, as such betrayals often do, with routine, and ended with a reckoning that forced Britain to question how power and trust intertwine behind closed doors. Harold Shipman didn't sit under studio lights or sign up for stress interviews, but the structure he entered as a young doctor taught a comparable lesson. Your inner life is secondary to performance. The psychology of the moment is important. In late 1960s and early 1970s British medicine, junior doctors absorbed identity by osmosis, rounds at dawn, terse supervision, a chain of command that prized compliance over confession. You learned to withstand humiliation in the corridor and to turn that sting into speed. On the wards, teaching by dress down was common. A registrar questioned you in front of nurses, exposed gaps, then moved on. A consultant corrected your charting with a tone that made the pen in your hand feel like evidence against you. It wasn't called abuse, it was called training. What stands out now in retrospect is how that style hardened a certain type of personality. If your self-worth already sat on competence, public critique didn't open you up. It made you double down on control. Meanwhile, surveillance increased without looking like surveillance. Drug registers, counter-signatures, cremation forms, each document created visibility that could be bypassed if a senior's word smoothed the way. Shipman learned the choreography: project certainty, anticipate questions before they're asked, normalize shortcuts as efficiency. The result is an internal script: perform, preempt, prevail, that leaves little room for reflection. When reflection threatens, you write faster. Practice added humiliation of a subtler kind, the erosion of clinical power by constraint. Patients arrived with complex needs, but time slots were brief. Hospital beds were scarce. Social care lagged. A GP sits between suffering and scarcity and feels the friction in their own body. Some bend toward empathy, stretching minutes. Some bend toward authority, tightening up. Shipman chose authority. He disliked being challenged, disliked delays, and learned to convert those irritants into procedural certainty, paper that closes a case. The parallel to a stress study sits here. Over years, repeated micro-confrontations, queries from families, pushback from colleagues, bureaucracy's small indignities, reframed care as a problem of dominance. To preserve his role, he didn't look inward. He manipulated outward. He developed a tone that flattened dissent, memorized phrases that ended debate, and rehearsed endings that left no oxygen for questions. In hindsight, you can hear that in the way he later documented symptoms that justified death after the fact, as if the record itself could retroactively produce truth. He also learned the institution's blind angles. Cremation forms required an independent doctor, but the independence was often nominal. Colleagues countersigned for colleagues as a matter of trust. Prescribing controls existed, yet a respected GP could access diamorphine without raising alarms if the chart looked right. Medical records, software, time-stamped edits, but audits were rare unless someone asked. The system taught him where to press, so that oversight turned into habit. Humiliation didn't produce remorse, it produced a contempt for scrutiny. He began to experience questions as challenges to his status, not as safeguards for patients. That shift matters. Once scrutiny equals insult, the person who values control treats transparency as an enemy to neutralize. He prepared, therefore, to neutralize in paperwork, not in argument. He constructed narratives, declines, refusals, chest pain, that met the requirements of a good death on paper, regardless of what actually happened in a living room at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The language of domination crept into his practice as structure, not slogan. Appointment books arranged like a conveyor. Home visits conducted alone. Doors shut quickly. Conversations short, declarative, concluding with a signature. He ran his day as a machine for certainty, and when uncertainty, a distressed daughter, a hesitant colleague, intruded, he reached for the tools that had always restored his authority: confident speech and completed forms. The machine demanded throughput, and throughput demanded endings. Could a different mentorship have altered the arc? Possibly. A senior who modeled humility, who rewarded candor after error, who insisted on shared verification, might have introduced friction, the good kind, that forces accountability. But what he learned again and again was that polish beats doubt, that the right words beat the right questions, and that institutions, when busy, accept closure from anyone who never seems rattled. When the experiment ended, when training became autonomy, the template was fixed. He didn't need a camera to feel watched. He needed only the pressure of his own standards and the expectation of deference he'd been fed for years. Graduate into general practice, and the environment looks like freedom: your list, your schedule, your discretion. To someone seeking control, it reads as opportunity, and opportunity, in his hands, became procedure sharpened into power. He arrived in early posts with momentum, clean notes, punctual ward rounds, and a confidence that read as competence. General practice promised autonomy without spectacle, a clinic where decisiveness could look like care. He learned the rhythms fast. A morning list that always overflowed. Home visits for the frail, an afternoon of results, prescriptions, and letters. The system prized doctors who moved, and he moved. But here's the problem. GP work is relational, not only procedural. Patients want eye contact, a pause, a sense that their story isn't an obstacle to the plan. He preferred the plan. Nurses noticed that he listened, then decided quickly. Partners in the practice noticed something else: an aversion to scrutiny. If a referral came back with questions, he bristled. If a family pressed, his tone flattened, firm, ending the conversation. Control was his signature. In hindsight, the center of gravity shifted when controlled drugs entered the picture. Diamorphine, the medical form of heroin, is legitimate in palliative care, devastating when misused. He learned its pharmacology, its speed, its quietness. In the right dose, a patient relaxes. In a little more, breathing softens, then slows. In paperwork, death can look like a heart that simply stopped. The psychology of the moment is important. A drug that ends pain also ends questions, if you hold the pen. His early career included a crack in the facade, an investigation in the late 1970s for forging prescriptions and misusing pethidine. He was fined, sent to treatment, and watched. The consequence should have anchored him. Instead, it taught him calibration. He learned which behaviors triggered attention, which didn't. He found that contrition performed well, and that time, if you kept your head down, washed reputations clean enough for a second chance. He took that chance and returned to general practice with the same ethic. Tighter. Teaching, in this context, wasn't classrooms. It was mentoring juniors and sharing protocols. He avoided it. He preferred solitude in the consultation room, an island where authority wasn't negotiated. Partners attempted gentle course corrections, more team meetings, clearer drug control procedures. He complied on paper. In daily life, he built silos: his patients, his bag, his home visits. When scrutiny threatened, he cited patient dignity, the need for privacy, the burden on families. The phrasing was hard to challenge without accusing a colleague of cruelty. Then came the quiet break. Not a resignation from medicine, but a resignation from accountability. He joined a practice structure that allowed greater independence, chose hours that ensured he could travel to homes when others weren't free, and consolidated his role in cremation paperwork. Microstory: an empty consulting room at day's end, the smell of hand gel, a stack of cremation forms set aside to process after hours. He aligns them, initials one, signs another, and the building hums with evening cleaners who know him as the last to leave. Withdrawal became design. He lived close to his patient list, walked familiar routes, carried the same black bag. Conversations narrowed to declarations: chest tightness, breathlessness, end of life, best at home. Families, grieving and trusting, accepted. Colleagues saw a man who worked hard, rarely took holidays, handled the difficult cases. The pattern hid in that performance. Impact arrived as an absence of friction. With each unchallenged certification, he rehearsed the ending he preferred: tidy, fast, uncontested. Ambition drained into a different fuel, the satisfaction of a day run to schedule, of problems resolved without debate. He stripped his professional life to essentials, authority, access, and forms. He didn't need prestige. He needed control. Withdrawal wasn't enough. He needed geography to cooperate. The town's aging population, the closeness of houses, the short walk between surgery and living rooms, all of it formed a map he could cover efficiently. He learned when families were out, when neighbors looked away, which locks were habitual, which kettles boiled longer. A life reduced to instruments, syringe, certificate, signature, waited for the moment when procedure and power would merge, and no one would interrupt the result. Hyde wasn't Montana, but the logic is parallel, control expressed as environment. For Shipman, the self-sufficiency took shape in a small radius surgery, streets, front rooms where he set the terms. The psychology of the moment is important. Routine, repeated without interruption, becomes a shelter and a tool. He curated his day like a closed ecosystem. Morning clinics that ran on his timing, home visits without witnesses, paperwork finished in his own language. He built a working cabin out of logistics. His black bag served as the bench, the ampules as components, the prescription pads as raw material. A short walk knit patients into a map of predictable stops. He liked homes where kettles boiled on habit, where keys lived on the same hooks, where neighbors nodded and moved on. He favored hours when family members were at work, when televisions murmured in adjoining semis, when a doorbell wouldn't ring. Scarcity of interruption, he cultivated it like a crop. Daily ritual stabilized him. Arrive early, review lists, clear quick cases fast. Then, home visits. He logged symptoms in a clipped style: breathlessness, chest pain, dizziness. He carried diamorphine and syringes as standard, a choice that he justified as compassionate preparedness. In hindsight, that preparedness doubled as opportunity. He insisted on dignity, on keeping frail patients at home, on avoiding distressing hospital transfers. Families heard kindness. He heard obedience to a plan he controlled. Trigger events were subtle but cumulative: a frail patient whose daughter questioned a dose, a colleague who asked to review drug logs, an undertaker who mentioned the frequency of his signatures with a light joke that wasn't light. Each instance felt to him like an intrusion into mastery. He responded by tightening the loop: fewer discussions, more decisions, quicker forms. The more the town breathed around him, the more he sealed his own air. Frustration shaped craft. He learned timing that minimized scrutiny. Late-day visits that bled into evening. Certificates prepared before phone lines were busy. Cremation forms advanced swiftly, so post-mortems seemed unnecessary. He mapped which colleagues would countersign without seeing the body, which would trust his clinical summary, which would take his word as enough. The system's seams, designed for efficiency among trusted professionals, became his working edges. He studied the pharmacology until it felt like procedure. Diamorphine given intravenously acts fast. Morphine metabolites linger. In a home, collapse reads as heart failure unless someone insists on tests. If the GP speaks calmly, if the certificate reads cleanly, grief moves forward. He adjusted doses to end breathing quietly, positioned bodies in chairs or on sofas to suggest a natural end, and kept the tableau tidy: cup on table, blanket folded, curtains half drawn. Staging, in clinical dress, anti-forensic habits grew alongside function. He documented symptoms retroactively in the electronic record, time-stamping notes after the death to build the narrative of decline. Refused hospital. Comfortable at home, increasing dyspnea. He used stock phrases that read as routine to administrators skimming for red flags. He signed forms in tidy batches, transporting them himself to speed cremation. He didn't hoard drugs at the surgery. He carried enough in the bag and replenished in ways that blended with legitimate palliative care. Micro-stories accumulate the pattern. A son is told to step into the kitchen while doctor settles her. A neighbor sees him arrive briskly and leave more slowly, face set, saying, "She's at peace." An undertaker receives the call before the family fully understands what happened. The velocity of events, visit, death, certificate, cremation, compresses suspicion into silence. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, erasure was procedural and fast. What stands out now in retrospect is the self-sufficiency masquerading as service. He positioned himself as the solution that required no one else. No ambulance crew, no hospital registrar, no coroner. Each avoided layer reduced the number of eyes. Each reduced eye increased his certainty. The feedback loop hardened. The smoother the process, the stronger his belief that he alone knew what should happen. He refined his devices the way an engineer iterates. When a family balked at cremation, he emphasized the distress a post-mortem would bring. When a colleague questioned frequency, he cited the aging list, comorbidities, the randomness of clusters. When record audits emerged, he tightened entries, aligned codes, corrected timestamps. He adapted language faster than others could formalize concern. And then there was the turn, not loud but decisive. Retaliation in his mind wasn't vengeance, it was the neutralization of interference. A daughter's insistence on hospital transfer became a problem to preempt on the next visit with firmer phrasing. A countersigner's reluctance meant choosing another colleague. The town's gentle intrusions, doorbells, shared landings, watchful neighbors, were sanded down by timing and tone until his working day felt as sealed as a cabin in the woods. Letters didn't travel, forms did. They moved through offices with the weight of a GP's certainty behind them, and each stamp was a small, final echo of his control. While others slept, the crematorium schedule advanced, and the record closed. He didn't need devices. He used doses. The campaign unfolded as a sequence of home visits and tidy paperwork that replaced shrapnel with silence. Targets weren't enemies in a manifesto. They were the elderly, the frail, the trusting, people who symbolized something to him only in how easily their endings could be managed. The symbolism sat in process, not politics. A GP's unchecked authority, the cremation furnace, the archive that accepted his words as fact. Device signatures appeared as patterns, bodies often found seated, fully dressed, a cup nearby, curtains half drawn, television murmuring, a room that read as peaceful because the agent worked fast. The carved initials were phrases. Refused hospital. Sudden collapse. Known heart disease. False return addresses lived in the electronic record. Retrospective notes typed hours later to grant yesterday's visit the symptoms that justified today's certificate. Booby traps were administrative. Cremation chosen quickly. A colleague's countersignature collected. The coroner avoided. He escalated through frequency, not spectacle. Neighbors noticed the black bag. Undertakers the phone calls. Crematorium clerks the same name in the log. While an airline bomb forces national policy, his method bent local norms. Funerals scheduled faster. Families coached to accept a natural end. The stakes rose quietly. If a plane can be targeted, everyone looks up. If a doctor can be trusted to kill, everyone looks down at the floor of their sitting room and wonders. Fatalities became names only after the pattern cracked. Kathleen Grundy, active and sharp, died suddenly. Morphine told a different story. Before her and after, there were many. Betty Lyons collapsed after a visit that had begun as reassurance. Marie West's family remembered a calm pronouncement, a swift certificate. Dozens of deaths, then hundreds suspected, each with similar staging. No resuscitation attempt documented, no ambulance summoned, no hospital referral insisted upon. Survivors existed only as the living left behind, carrying trauma that sounded mundane in retelling, the way a kettle boiled the day their mother stopped breathing, the way a key turned when the doctor let himself out. Staging and deception matured as pressure grew. When a colleague asked about the volume of diamorphine, he cited the burden of palliative needs. When a family questioned cause, he named comorbidities with crisp confidence. Intentional errors infected the notes. Misspelled symptoms that looked rushed and therefore authentic. Vague time entries that blurred exact moments. Stock phrases that slipped past administrators scanning for anomalies. He planted misleading impressions the way a bomber plants fragments. Each one engineered to send scrutiny elsewhere. The psychology of the victims' families mattered. Grief wants a story that ends, gently if possible. He offered it. A soft voice, a quick signature, a promise that death came without pain. In that exchange, suspicion surrendered. National anxiety didn't arrive with sirens. It seeped in later, when exhumations began, when the same careful doctor's name peeled off old certificates and showed up in headlines. Undertakers replayed routines, receptionists rethreaded schedules in their minds, and the town reorganized its memory around a chilling mystery hiding in plain sight. Impact fed back into institutions. Protocols shifted. Practices audited controlled drug registers with new rigor, demanded dual custody for diamorphine, insisted that cremation forms be signed by truly independent doctors who examined the body. Mailrooms didn't change, mortuaries did. The Unabomber label compressed fear for a nation. Dr. Death compressed betrayal for a community that had opened its doors. The task force here wasn't a federal alphabet. It was a patchwork of Greater Manchester Police, forensic pathologists, and National Health Service administrators suddenly reading timestamps like evidence. Meanwhile, he refined technique. Dosage aligned with body mass and frailty. Delivery chosen for speed. Intravenous when possible. Subcutaneous when time allowed. He gauged minutes to respiratory arrest. Learned which family questions to preempt, which neighbors wouldn't interrupt. He rehearsed lines, calibrated pauses, and learned that certainty delivered calmly ends most arguments. Craft in this context was clinical. Steady hands, controlled tone, consistent paperwork. Survivors of his method weren't the narrowly saved. They were the ones whose relatives were not cremated yet, whose insistence drew a coroner's eye, their trauma displayed as vigilance. Some refused to let funerals proceed until tests returned. Some kept jewelry and paperwork in a folder, fearful of erasure. They learned a new ritual. Double-check the doctor. Ask for a second opinion. Slow everything down. It felt disloyal in the moment. In hindsight, it saved evidence. National media widened the stakes. A GP accused of murdering patients ruptures a covenant, the quiet agreement that the person who touches your wrist for a pulse wants you to live. Pressure mounted across surgeries. Partners revisited loan visit policies. Receptionists logged more details. Countersigners demanded actual examinations. The National Health Service had to teach the public how to question without sabotaging care. Ask about options, ask for referrals, ask for time. In a system built on trust, it was a hard pivot. He adapted as long as he could. When an undertaker joked about seeing his signature again, he smiled and blamed the demographics of his list. When computer audits loomed, he completed notes to inline justification. When countersigners hesitated, he selected others. Each adjustment echoed a bomber shifting materials after an ATF bulletin. Always one step to the side of the new rule, always just plausible. And yet, the pattern thickened enough to hold. The campaign's signature, once dismissed as coincidence, crystallized in overlays, death times near his visits, morphine in tissues of people never prescribed opiates, records amended after death. The escalation wasn't in blast radius, it was in count. Not 3 victims, but many. Not a cause declared, but a cause of death, written again and again by the same hand. While this was happening in Hyde's front rooms, something else was taking shape in an evidence locker. Tissue samples, audit logs, and families ready to speak. Devices had spoken in silence. Now, the voices would. He never wrote a manifesto, but he did leave a paper trail. Short, clipped, decisive, that tried to turn bureaucracy into belief. The psychology of the moment is important. When investigators opened Shipman's patient records, they found something that read like doctrine disguised as routine, a worldview where autonomy meant his authority, suffering meant a tidy end, and forms with a scripture that made it all seem natural. What did his text argue, line by line? That hospital is indignity, and home is mercy. That frailty equals inevitability. That a good death doesn't need witnesses, just a confident clinician and a pen that moves without shaking. He didn't say it aloud. He embedded it in phrases that recur like a creed. Refused hospital, increasing dyspnea, comfortable at home. In hindsight, those lines weren't notes, they were a program. And the program ran because a system let it. Unlike a published tract, his statements hid in software timestamps and cremation forms. Posthumous entries filled gaps, retrofitting a narrative of decline to bodies that could no longer speak. He wrote in a voice that administrators trusted, calm, terse, surgical. The effect was ideological because it reordered who had moral say at the end of life. Family doubts were framed as emotion. His judgment read as fact. That asymmetry is the essence of a chilling mystery. How certainty colonizes grief. Public reception, when the pattern broke, sounded like the reaction to a manifesto revealed after harm. Uneasy recognition, mixed with outrage. People recognized pieces. Of course, many elders want to die at home. Of course, avoiding aggressive intervention can be humane. But the method, diamorphine administered by a man who then authored the cause, voided consent. The same sentences that once soothed families now looked like the camouflage of coercion. Communities reeled not because the words were alien, but because they were familiar, repurposed. Ethically, the fracture ran through every living room he entered. Loved ones had believed him, sometimes against their own hesitation. Undertakers had trusted the forms. Colleagues had countersigned in good faith. When those habits were mapped against exhumations that found morphine where none was prescribed, trust inverted into self-reproach. Why didn't we ask for a post-mortem? Why did we rush the cremation? The psychology of the moment is important because guilt can paralyze, and paralysis is how patterns persist. Investigators treated his records like analysts treat a polemic, identify themes, flag contradictions, compare drafts to outcomes. They found linguistic fingerprints, stock phrases repeated across unrelated deaths, time-stamped edits aligning with the need to justify certificates, a reliance on sudden collapse, unsupported by prior complaints in the living patient's notes. They matched those patterns to tissue results. The overlaps weren't literary, they were lethal. Meanwhile, the town held two truths at once. Palliative care can be compassionate, paperwork can be weaponized. The lesson tilted institutions toward procedure that resists persuasion. Cremation forms were redesigned to require stronger independence. Countersigning demanded actual examination. Electronic systems locked after death to prevent backfilled narratives. It looked bureaucratic, and it was, but the aim was moral. Redistribute power back to the living, even in mourning. What stands out now in retrospect is how Shipman's argument depended on speed. Speed to pronounce, speed to form, speed to flame. Slow any one of those, and his authority meets air. Families reported that when they paused, called a sibling, asked for an ambulance, sought another GP, the tone shifted. He pressed. That urgency, replayed across cases, reads like the quiet coercion of a doctrine that can't tolerate debate. Some asked the forbidden question: was there any principle, however warped, under this? Investigators considered, then returned to evidence. His edits protected him, not patients. His dosing silenced. It didn't console. The jewelry found in his home, the forged will, the pattern of isolated visits, each detail narrowed the space for theories that cast him as a misguided purist. Ideology, if present at all, was a cover for appetite, for control, for unchallenged endings, for the satisfaction of a day without interruption. And yet, for all this, the aftermath produced a counter-manifesto written by the community. It said, "Second opinions are not insults." It said, "Independence in certification means eyes on the body, not just a signature on a line." It said, "Compassion without transparency is risk." In Hyde, that text wasn't published, it was practiced. Nurses kept stricter drug registers. Partners reviewed home visit policies. Families learned to ask for time. Identification was one thing. Accountability would come next. His sentences had carried him for years. Now the record would speak against him, line by line, in court. At first, the profile leaned toward coincidence. A busy GP with many elderly patients, a cluster effect, an unfortunate run. Analysts tested the benign hypothesis because accusing a doctor of serial murder risks breaking public trust. But here's the twist. When Greater Manchester Police overlaid death certificates with practice lists, visit logs, and cremation forms, a contour emerged. Time of death near Shipman's visits, rapid certification, cremation prioritized. Evidence had to outrun assumption. Postal routes didn't matter here. Paperwork pathways did. Investigators pulled Form B and Form C packets from the crematorium, charting who signed, when, and on what claims. They built a matrix of countersigners, and one name recurred alongside his. Independence, meant as protection, had collapsed into routine. Undertaker ledgers, indexed by date, showed a tempo that matched his clinic diary. The pattern wasn't just frequent, it was rhythmic. Errors crept in because he planted them to look human. Handwritten notes included familiar, stock phrases, occasionally a misspelling that read as haste. Electronic records held time-stamped edits after death, plausibly a late tidy-up, unless it repeats across cases that required justification for sudden cardiac ends. Forensic IT specialists cloned the practice computer, then reconstructed audit logs to demonstrate when entries were made, by whom, and whether they overwrote earlier text. The audit trail, once obscure, began to speak. Toxicology reframed suspicion as fact. After Kathleen Grundy, exhumations extended cautiously. Pathologists sampled femoral tissue and hair when available, seeking morphine and its metabolite ratios. Levels appeared that didn't fit therapeutic use for non-cancer patients. Chain of custody was airtight, sealed bags, documented transfers, blind testing where possible. Each positive narrowed the argument from possibility to probability. The family lead mattered early and late. Grundy's daughter flagged the forged will. But other families contributed micro-corroborations. Jewelry missing after visits, a sudden insistence on cremation, discouragement of ambulances. Detectives took sworn statements, then tested memory against records, phone times, call logs, undertaker dispatches. Where recollection and timestamp met, credibility stiffened. Survivors' voices, often doubting their own instincts, were scaffolded by data. Breakthroughs arrived in clusters. A stash of jewelry in his home, later identified by relatives. Controlled drug registers that didn't reconcile with prescription histories. Syringe disposal practices inconsistent with claimed palliative volumes. The most unsettling discovery was conceptual, a doctor exploiting the very compassion protocols designed to ease dying. Investigators adjusted their own posture, moving from tentative to methodical certainty, profiling recalibrated. Not a frenzied sadist, but a controlled professional who prized autonomy, disliked scrutiny, and used language to preempt challenge. The psychology of the moment is important. He didn't need secrecy in the dark. He needed deference in daylight. That informed strategy. Interviews with staff focused on his reaction to oversight. Who did he resist? Who did he charm? When did his tone harden? Patterns of control are behavioral, not just chemical. Warrants expanded, but entry remained restrained. Detectives seized computers, drug logs, and personal papers first, preserving volatile data. Scenes were photographed to capture order, forms stacked, stamps aligned, ampules arranged, because arrangement testifies. Forensic accountants traced bank movements around the forged will, then compared against his declared income. Motive theories were kept provisional, means and method carried the weight. Errors by the system were acknowledged, not weaponized. Countersigners admitted trust-based practices. Administrators conceded that audits flagged volume, not timing. The NHS cooperated, providing policy context, so a jury could understand how a GP's signature travels. That transparency mattered. It transformed institutional embarrassment into credible reform. The case crossed from mosaic to narrative when overlays converged. Exhumation results, amended records, countersignature clusters, and witness accounts unified by sequence, visit, collapse, certificate, cremation. Prosecutors could now tell a story anchored in timestamps and tissue, not inference. What nobody knew, until the files were complete, was how many graves would answer when asked. While that was happening in Hyde, court strategy formed. Identification was one thing. Explaining the machinery of trust he'd bent would be another. The investigation had its arc, profiling corrected, errors absorbed, breakthroughs logged, ready to meet the system he once mastered, in open court. The door opened onto neatness, not chaos. A hallway table, a tidy rack for coats, the faint smell of antiseptic. In his study, drawers aligned, labels straight, a computer humming softly. This room was his workshop, his bench, his control surface. The psychology of the moment is important. Arrangement signals intention. He arranged to be believed. Investigators moved carefully, eyes on order. On the desk, cremation forms in clean stacks, a fountain pen placed parallel to the keyboard, certificates awaiting entries that would read as routine. A small tray held stamps, rubber date markers, and self-adhesive labels. Paper wasn't decoration. Paper was the instrument. He had built a system where ink carried more force than a scalpel. They opened a cabinet. Inside, diamorphine ampules, sealed, logged on separate slips that didn't match prescription histories. Next shelf, syringes, alcohol swabs, tourniquets, all arranged with surgical symmetry. The bag he carried to Holmes sat ready on a chair, its contents replenished and precise. This wasn't hoarding. It was a kit tuned for speed, calibrated to end a visit quickly, cleanly, without witnesses. The computer held the core. Forensic IT cloned the drive, preserving the audit trail. Patient records revealed posthumous edits, symptoms backfilled after death, increasing dyspnea, refused hospital, comfortable at home, timestamps mapped to evenings, the hour when offices are quiet and calls slow. He had learned to alter the past by typing in the present, producing a record that preempted questions he preferred not to answer aloud. Journals weren't diaries, they were lists. Not reflections, but tasks, drug orders, cremation packets to file, colleagues to approach for countersignatures. In a small notebook, initials matched to addresses and preferred times of day for visits. Next to some entries, A single tick, done. The absence of emotion is unsettling. Compassion, if present, is procedural. A good outcome equals a completed form, not a conversation that took longer than 10 minutes. Forensic mapping began with objects. The pen left micro-scratches consistent across dozens of certificates. Printer, toner composition matched documents filed at the crematorium. Rubber stamps in his drawer produced impressions identical to date marks on forms already archived. Even the way he folded, paperwork repeated, tri-folded, crisp, always in the same direction. An unconscious signature in paper. A velvet-lined box in the wardrobe held jewelry, rings, watches, brooches. Families later identified pieces as missing after deaths he certified. Each item carried residue of intimacy, now repurposed as silent proof. The juxtaposition is stark. Formal order on the desk, private trophies in a dark box. Investigators considered motive, but the items functioned as evidence of proximity and control, not riches. Control was the currency. Drug registers sat on a shelf above head height, where a quick glance would miss them. Entries tried to reconcile stock and use, but totals slipped. When compared to prescribing logs, the mismatch widened. He had learned which reconciliations administrators checked and which they trusted by habit. That knowledge sits like a blueprint. Pressure points identified, oversight mapped, neutralization built into routine. Microstories reveal intent. A pre-signed condolence card set aside for a patient still alive that morning. A sticky note reminding him to call an undertaker before noon. A cremation packet assembled ahead of a visit. Each detail compresses time between event and erasure. He wasn't responding to death. He was staging it, then sealing it with efficiency the community mistook for kindness. Handwriting analysts compared his cremation entries to clinic notes. Same compact print, same clipped loops on G, the same restrained pressure. Consistency helped knit documents across years. In the electronic record, audit logs recorded the user ID attached to every edit. It was almost always his. The machine that once protected him, software trusted because it looked professional, now testified against him line by line. The room's geometry mattered. Desk to filing cabinet, 2 steps. Filing cabinet to printer, 1 pivot. Printer to door, a straight line. He optimized for throughput the way a production engineer does, removing friction. He could enter, write, print, assemble, and leave with the packet that would finalize a life. That choreography tells you more than any flourish. He valued speed inside a frame of certainty. There were no medical textbooks on palliative ethics open on the table, no sticky tabs on guidelines. Instead, administrative manuals, a BNF for dosing, and a clean diary with times blocked in narrow bands. He practiced medicine as process. The heart of the cabin was a workstation where endings could be authored and archived before grief learned to ask a question. In hindsight, what stands out is how the space enshrined a belief. Order equals truth. He trusted tidy stacks, clean signatures, synchronized stamps. He built a room that looked like diligence and used it to manufacture finality. Standing there, detectives understood the threat wasn't a hidden lab. It was a quiet study engineered to turn trust into paperwork, and paperwork into silence. Courtrooms measure certainty in careful steps, and this one began with capacity. Could he understand the charges and assist his defense? Psychiatrists examined him, noting traits of narcissism, rigidity, and a profound need for control. Others described depressive features without psychosis. The psychology of the moment is important. A man who'd authored endings on paper now faced a forum where language couldn't rewrite facts, only reveal them. He listened, composed, absorbing that scrutiny had become procedure. Prosecutors built a case that refused melodrama, relying instead on sequence. They laid out exhumation toxicology, morphine ratios incompatible with therapeutic use, and posthumous record edits time-stamped after death. They showed countersignature clusters, cremation packets assembled with unusual speed, and jewelry recovered from his home that families recognized. Witnesses recounted small, precise moments, discouraged ambulances, closed doors, a doctor's calm assertion that hospital wasn't necessary. Evidence formed a lattice of means, method, and access. The defense tested the lattice for weakness. They pressed the limits of toxicological inference in exhumed tissue, suggested natural cardiac events could mimic opioid findings, and argued that retrospective note completion could be administrative catch-up, not deception. They floated the possibility of misguided palliative care, not murder. But here's the twist. The pattern didn't hinge on a single inference. It repeated across cases, visit, collapse, certificate, cremation, documents amended afterward to justify what had already been pronounced. Competency debates crossed with strategy. A mental disorder defense might mitigate culpability, but he rejected any narrative that undermined control. He presented as lucid, tactical, preoccupied with maintaining professional dignity even while denied it. He challenged procedural points with clipped precision. The court concluded he grasped the stakes, understood counsel, and chose his posture deliberately. Capacity meant the story would be told in evidence, not diagnosis. The trial's rhythm turned on the audit trail. Forensic IT specialists testified about user IDs, edit timestamps, and access logs. Pathologists explained metabolite ratios, chain of custody, and why morphine in non-cancer patients demanded explanation. Administrative witnesses mapped cremation protocols, independence requirements, and how those safeguards had been hollowed by habit. Jurors didn't need to master medicine. They needed to see chronology hardened by documentation. Each exhibit returned to the same structure: authority exercised, oversight bypassed, record adjusted. Families took the stand, and names replaced statistics. A daughter described hearing the phrase, "she's at peace," while her mother's tea sat cooling. A son recalled being asked to wait in the kitchen, then being told not to make a fuss with an ambulance. An undertaker spoke about the tempo of calls that always seemed to involve the same GP. The courtroom observed silence shaped by those voices, grief moving facts forward. In hindsight, this recentered harm where it belonged. Mid-proceedings, pressure converged. The Crown's case was dense, the defense choices narrow. A guilty plea arrived, sparing a protracted contest but cementing responsibility. He accepted multiple life sentences, a whole life tariff that meant no parole. The moment registered as almost clinical, rights acknowledged, consequences stated. The sentence entered. No manifesto, no grand statement, just a compression of years into a few words he couldn't edit. Impact radiated outward. The NHS instituted reforms, stricter controls on controlled drugs, dual custody, real independence for cremation countersignatures, and electronic records that lock after death except with auditable, multi-user overrides. Coroners received clearer triggers to investigate community deaths. Practices built internal checks, second opinions for end-of-life certifications, home visit chaperone policies, and routine mortality reviews. These weren't cosmetic. They redistributed power, so endings no longer travelled solely on a single pen. Public meaning settled into a difficult clarity. Palliative care remained humane, but compassion divorced from transparency became suspect. Communities learned new rituals. Slow the process, ask for corroboration, insist on examination. The phrase, Dr. Death, didn't just name a man. It marked a breach in a covenant between patient and clinician. Trust survived, but not unexamined. In Hyde, neighbours kept watch in gentler ways. Accompany appointments, keep copies, share timelines. Prison life reduced him to routine he didn't author. Reports described a controlled inmate. Tidy cell, deliberate habits, grievances about mail and access. He remained resistant to psychiatric framing, preferring the neutrality of procedure even when it no longer protected him. Years later, authorities reported his death in custody. The file on the man closed. The files he had written continued to testify. For the profession, the aftermath became curriculum. Trainees studied the case not as spectacle, but as systems failure, where deference replaced independence, where software design enabled retroactive truth, where collegiality diluted scrutiny. For communities, the lesson was sharper. Grief deserves time, and time resists erasure. The court had delivered a sentence. The culture carried the reform. The psychology of grievance in this case isn't ideology. It's entitlement tethered to control. Isolation didn't create violence, but it insulated his choices from friction, letting clinical certainty harden into private rule. Think of a feedback loop. Each unchallenged certification validated speed. Each cremation confirmed the narrative. Each audit he outpaced increased his confidence. Without resistors, independent countersigners, chaperoned visits, locked records, that loop overheated. Institutional harms were accelerants, not excuses. Deference within primary care, habit-based countersignatures, and software that allowed posthumous edits combined to lower the cost of deceit. The lesson is systemic. Safeguards fail when they exist only on paper, or when trust replaces verification. Ethical medicine requires structured pauses, time for a second opinion, space for a coroner's question. especially where endings move quickly. For families, vigilance shouldn't mean hostility. It means practical protections. Keep medication lists current, ask what alternatives exist, request hospital transfer when doubt persists, and invite another clinician to witness significant decisions. For practices, redesign matters. Dual custody of controlled drugs, random audits that examine timing as well as volume, and strict independence for cremation examinations. Electronic records should lock after death, requiring multi-user authentication to amend, with alerts to management and, where appropriate, the coroner. Clinical culture must change its incentives. Reward candor after error, not polish after pressure. Teach juniors that a colleague's authority ends where a patient's safety begins. Normalize chaperoned home visits for high-risk contexts, and rotate countersigning responsibilities to disrupt cozy routines. In hindsight, the most dangerous phrase in Hyde wasn't a forged symptom. It was, "That's how we do it." Public storytelling has to resist glamorizing certainty. Dr. Death compresses a breach of care into a headline. The real work is slower, naming victims, explaining protocols in plain language, and showing how small reforms prevent large harms. Compassion remains central. Palliative care is not the problem. Opacity is. Families deserve dignity and transparency at once. Agency still sits with people. If something feels rushed, say so. If a signature arrives before questions are answered, pause the process. If the explanation depends only on one person's word, ask for another pair of eyes. Systems should expect these pauses, design for them, and thank them. The goal isn't suspicion as lifestyle. It's friction where finality becomes irreversible. In the end, Shipman's power was procedural. So is the remedy. Build procedures that make truth collaborative, not authored. Make time the default resistor. When endings can't be undone, slowing down isn't defiance. It's care.